concept to understand because it's the same as the everyday definition. Motivation is why you do what you do. The most important to think of when you see the word motivation is, am I looking for the author's motivation or for a specific character's motivation? And this can change depending on whether you have fiction or nonfiction. In nonfiction, you're usually looking for the author's motivation. Why did the author write this piece? What is the author trying to persuade me to do? What's the author's theme and message? And all of those questions will tell you what the author's motivation is in writing this nonfiction piece. So any article, any nonfiction book will usually focus on the author's motivation instead of a specific character's motivation, because usually there aren't characters in most nonfiction. The exception, of course, being biographies or autobiographies. And the reason that motivation is so important in nonfiction is because motivation reveals bias. And bias tells you that the author has a motivation that is a little too far in one direction, that the author is not objective, that the author is not looking at all sides of the argument because their motivation is persuading them to be slanted or biased toward a different side of the argument. This could be as simple as an article that is persuading you to buy something. The author is clearly motivated to say very positive things about it. It could be a politician specifically urging you to support one person because their motivation is for you to support this same person that they do. Or it could just be that the author genuinely prefers one side or one thing to another. You see this happen with sports all the time, where people have loyalties and motivation to support a particular team or a particular player and ignore the facts regarding other players or other teams. And there's nothing wrong with an author showing bias as long as they acknowledge it. These things are usually called editorials. They can be called pro-con pieces. They can show up in the opinion sections of newspapers. The issue is when there's a motivation or a bias that is not clearly stated, when the author presents themselves as objective, but in reality are biased or motivated to persuade you in a certain direction without clearly announcing that. Fiction is where it starts to get a little more complicated because every character has a motivation, and some of your more complex characters have multiple motivations that sometimes contradict each other. When a character has more than one motivation and these are in conflict with each other, this can often be an example of internal conflict, which we have another video on if you don't remember that concept. And usually motivation refers to the main character or the protagonist's motivation, and that can often be boiled down to a nice little one-sentence summary. For instance, in A Wrinkle in Time, the motivation is for Meg to find her father. In The Giver, it is for Jonah to realize the truth and to escape, to find real freedom. In The Other Wes Moore, the motivation is to not be trapped by a social system and to succeed in life. In The Catcher in the Rye, the motivation for Holden is that he wants to find some sort of meaning in life and find a way to live his life authentically and not be phony like the rest of the world. In The Invisible Man, it starts off as a motivation to achieve an education and to prove that he can make something in his life. And in Lord of the Rings, the motivation is to defeat the Dark Lord Sauron. But on the other hand, protagonists aren't the only characters that have motivation. The antagonists have motivation as well. In The Lord of the Rings, Sauron wants to have control over Middle-earth, and so he tries to stop the hobbits. In The Invisible Man, the antagonists attempt to stop him because they don't want a successful African-American man. In The Catcher in the Rye, well, Holden's kind of his own worst enemy, so that one doesn't work out very well. In The Other Wes Moore, you have antagonists that self-destruct, that fulfill other people's expectations of themselves. In The Giver, the society doesn't want anybody to achieve freedom or know the truth because then they don't have power. And in A Wrinkle in Time, the giant brain wants control over everybody. So you see that freedom and control are very strong motivations a lot. The protagonists are usually on the side of, I want to achieve freedom, I want to live my life, and the antagonists are typically on the side of, I want to control or have power over the protagonist and over everyone else. It's a very common motivation. But even though there's an overarching motivation, there are lots of smaller motivations as well. For instance, Meg is motivated by her love for Calvin, by her love for her father, and by her love for her brother, Charles Wallace. And these little motivations play into her larger motivation of wanting to rescue her father and wanting to prove that she is brave. With people like Wes Moore, though, he has a conflicting motivation which creates an internal conflict for him. He wants to be successful like his mother wants him to be, like his father was, but at the same time he wants to be accepted by all the kids in the neighborhood. And this leads to a struggle because his motivations are in conflict. You can't be smart and educated and cool and also fit in with the people that he wanted to fit in. And so this creates an internal conflict for Wes Moore that he has to struggle to overcome. A lot of times, writing prompts or questions in tests are going to want you to boil down motivation to one simple thing. And that is very difficult because it's a complex web. Just like real people, we don't always have the same motivation, and sometimes we have two or three motivations, and sometimes we have multiple motivations, but one of them is stronger than the rest of them. The important thing to look for is the specific passage that they give you. If you have a question about motivation and you have a passage, look for specific evidence in that passage, because even if you're familiar with the larger work, they might not be asking for the motivation from the entire book or the entire article. They might be asking for the motivation from one sentence or one paragraph. And that's what you need to hone in on. And sometimes you have to look deeper than the surface. In The Catcher in the Rye, it seems like Holden's motivated by a desire just to annoy everybody, to piss everybody off, and to show that he's cooler than everybody else. But if you look beyond the surface, you realize that Holden is hurting. Holden has problems, he has issues, he's struggling with a world that seems unfair in the wake of the death of his brother and in all the things that he's struggled through. His motivation is to find some sort of meaning and clarity in life, not just to be an annoying jerk. So, motivation, the why you do what you do, it applies to nonfiction, it applies to fiction, it's complex, there are often many layers, but you need to look for the specific one that they ask for.